Good morning, and thank you for joining this online virtual service of the First Unitarian Church of Alton on this 11th day of April 2021. I am Joy Heft, and I serve as a worship associate, and am also the pianist for this church. We are a small lay-led congregation located in Alton, Illinois, on the bluffs of the Mississippi River. Due to the pandemic, our services are now virtual. Past and present services can be found on our church YouTube channel. We hope to see you at our Castle on the Hill sometime soon, when we can return to worship together face to face. In the meantime, we welcome everyone to this virtual home of comfort, spirit, justice, and hope. We are Unitarian Universalists. Last month, we began this series with Unitarian history up until the 17th century and the people who reawakened Unitarianism in Europe. This week, we will hear about the people who influenced Unitarianism in England in the 17th and 18th century, and then hop across the ocean to learn about the Unitarians in early America. We begin our service with a prelude. If you have a candle nearby, please join me as I light my own and in saying our unison words for the chalice lighting. We hallow this time together by kindling the lamp of our heritage. Our first hymn on the subject of choice is not from our hymnal, but from a series of small songbooks put out by the UUA in 1989. Titled Signature Collection Songbooks. The hymn will be played through once before we sing. Please join me in singing on the subject of choice. we offer a gentle reminder that this community of faith is supported only by your giving. We need each other, and in times of trial, we need each other even more. You can mail your gift to the First Unitarian Church, Post Office Box 494, Alton, Illinois 62002. Or you can give electronically by searching for First Unitarian Church of Alton on the Giblify app or via the link on our webpage. You can also give through PayPal if you prefer. Give what you will, for you are a generous people. If you know it, please join me in our offering prayer. May this offering equip us to inspire love and seek justice. Our reading today is number 592 in our hymnal, titled The Free Mind, written by William Ellery Channing and adapted. I call that mind free, which masters the senses, and which recognizes its own reality and greatness, which passes life, not in asking what it shall eat or drink, but in hungering, thirsting, and seeking after righteousness. I call that mind free, which jealously guards its intellect's rights and powers, which does not content itself with a passive or hereditary faith, which opens itself to light whensoever it may come, which receives new truth as an angel from heaven. I call that mind free, which is not passively framed by outward circumstances, and is not the creature of accidental impulse, which discovers everywhere the radiant signatures of the infinite Spirit, and in them finds help to its own spiritual enlargement. I call that mind free, which protects itself against the usurpations of society, and does not cower to human opinion, which refuses to be the slave or tool of the many of the few, and guards its empire over itself as nobler than the empire of the world. I call that mind free, which resists the bondage of habit, which does not mechanically copy the past, nor live in its old virtues, but which listens for new and higher monitions of conscience, and rejoices to pour itself forth in fresh and higher exertions. I call that mind free, which sets no bounds to its love, which wherever they are seen delights in virtue and sympathizes with suffering, which recognizes in all human beings the image of God and the rights of God's children, and offers itself up a willing sacrifice to the cause of humankind. I call that mind free, which is cast off all fear, but that of wrongdoing, in which no menace or peril can enthrall, which is calm in the midst of tumults, and possesses itself, though all else be lost. We now begin to hear about Unitarianism in England from the 17th to the early 19th century. Socinian theology continued to have a significant influence on the Unitarians in England during the 17th century. The Unitarian approach to looking at God as one became more widespread in the Church of England during the 17th century. There were a number of people during that time that helped spread and grow the views of Unitarianism. We will be looking at John Biddle, Joseph Priestley, Theophilus Lindsey, and Isaac Newton. John Biddle lived from 1616 to 1662. He was an educator, a schoolmaster, and a lay theologian in Gloucester, England. He wrote and spoke exclusively on his views on anti-Trinitarianism, about his manuscript titled 12 Arguments Drawn Out of Scripture, wherein the commonly received opinion touching the deity of the Holy Spirit is clearly and fully refuted. Phew, that's a long title. His reputation as a heretic began, in the eyes of the Anglican Church, with the above manuscript, which unknowingly was given to the magistrates by a treacherous friend. In 1645, John was summoned to the parliamentary committee in Gloucester and committed to prison. He was released 2 years later, but again published another manuscript, and was again taken into custody, along with his manuscript, the 12 Arguments, which were then burned. Biddle continued to attack the doctrine of the Trinity, believing that the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost were not equal. In 1648, Parliament made speaking out against the Church and the Trinity a cause for the death penalty. But influential friends made it possible for Biddle to live in Staffordshire under surveillance until 1652, when he again was imprisoned. John was released the same year under the protection of Oliver Cromwell, an English general and statesman during the English Civil War, as well as the leader of the British Isles from 1653 until his death. John Biddle and his supporters, called Biddleians, were all Unitarian supporters and began to meet regularly for Sunday worship. Their views resembled those of the Socinians in Poland. In December of 1654, John Biddle was again imprisoned for publishing another manuscript titled Twofold Catechism. The following month, he was released briefly, but then rearrested for heresy. Reluctant to see him executed, Cromwell again rescued Biddle and sent him to one of the isles in Scilly in 1655. On his return to London in 1662 as a preacher, John Biddle was again arrested and fined £100, in which he was unable to pay. He was immediately confined to prison, where he died later that year. Biddle's appeal for conscience and his push for religious freedom was one of the major milestones in the establishment of religious freedom in England. Thus, he was considered the father of English Unitarianism. Joseph Priestley was born in March of 1773 in England and died in February 1804 in Northumberland, Pennsylvania, in America. He was an English clergyman, a political theorist, an educator, a physical scientist, whose work contributed to the advances in experimental chemistry, as well as in liberal political and religious thought. Joseph Priestley was born into a strong Calvinist family. In 1752, he entered the Dissenting Academy at Daventry, which is named for their unwillingness to conform to the Church of England, and therefore were prevented by the Act of Uniformity in 1662 from entering English universities. Priestley received an excellent education in philosophy, science, languages, and literature at Daventry. He became a furious freethinker in religion and renounced the Calvinist doctrines of original sin and atonement. Priestley embraced a rational Unitarianism that rejected the Trinity and asserted the perfectibility of man. He was ordained a dissenting minister in 1762. Joseph Priestley published over 150 liberal political works and made many scientific discoveries, as well as help establish the first Unitarian Church in London. Priestley's interest in science intensified in 1765 when he met the American scientist and statesman Benjamin Franklin, who encouraged him to publish The History and Present State of Electricity with Original Experiments in 1767. He went on to show that the scientific progress depended more on the accumulation of new facts rather than just the theoretical insights of a few genius men. This view of the scientific methodology shaped Priestley's electrical experiments, in which he anticipated the inverse square law of electrical attraction, discovered that charcoal conducts electricity, and made observations on the relationship between electricity and chemical change. This led him to develop a larger field of original experiments in other areas than electricity. In 1767, Priestley began intensive experimental investigations into chemistry. Between 1772 and 1790, he published 6 volumes of manuscripts on different kinds of gases, or airs, as they were called then in Britain, and more than a dozen articles on his experiments on gases. British chemists had previously identified 3 types of gases: oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen. Priestley went on to discover several uses of oxygen while performing experiments with these gases in 1774. He went on to identify 9 more gases, including nitrous oxide, which was later called laughing gas, and carbon monoxide. Priestley also discovered the theory of photosynthesis in plants, which is how they take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. Priestley viewed his scientific pursuits as consistent with the commercial and entrepreneurial interests of the English dissenters. He believed that social progress required the development of science-based commerce. This was reinforced as he became a preacher at the New Meeting House in Birmingham, England in 1790. He also became a member of the Lunar Society, a group who applied the principles of science and technology towards solving the problems experienced in the 18th century urban life. When confronted with the multitude of diseases that plagued the growing population, Priestley designed an apparatus that produced carbonated water, a mixture of infusing carbon dioxide and water, that he thought would provide medicinal benefit to sufferers of scurvy and various fevers. It was ultimately proved ineffective in treating those disorders, but the technique later made it possible for the development of soda water, thus establishing himself the father of carbonation. Through science and faith, Priestley became a Unitarian minister who sought and gained further evidence supporting his newly found belief in a benevolent God, rather than a vengeful God of his Calvinist youth. He claimed that the doctrines of Unitarian Socinianism were consistent with a rational reading of the Bible. He insisted that Jesus Christ was a mere man, who also preached the resurrection of the body, rather than the immortality of a non-existent soul. Joseph Priestley was a supporter and organizer of modern Unitarianism in England, alongside his friend Theophilus Lindsey, who he helped establish the first Unitarian Church in 1774. Many people in England continued to oppose the idea of choice in the matter of religious faith. In 1791, scientist and Unitarian minister Joseph Priestley found that his laboratory had been burned down, and he fled to America, where he established several Unitarian churches in the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area. Theophilus Lindsey was one of the most prominent and controversial English clergymen in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Theophilus Lindsey was born in Middlewich, Cheshire, in June of 1723 and died in 1808. He was educated at the Leeds Free School and at St. John's College in Cambridge, where he became a fellow in 1747. He was then ordained and became a parish priest the same year. After that, he traveled throughout Europe as a tutor to the young Duke of Northumberland. Around 1764, Lindsey began to entertain anti-Trinitarian views and was troubled in conscience about their inconsistency with the Anglican belief. Later that year, he founded one of the first Sunday schools in England and began to preach anti-Trinitarian views regarding their inconsistency with the Anglican Church. In 1769, Lindsay developed a close friendship with Joseph Priestley, which served to foster his new beliefs. Lindsay's other acquaintances included Benjamin Franklin and Richard Price. His requests for liberalism within the Church of England were ignored, so he subsequently resigned from the church and founded a separate Unitarian chapel in London in 1774. His chapel became one of the focal points for theology and politically unsupported ideas during the 1770s and early 1780s. Theophilus Lindsay and Joseph Priestley together founded the First Unitarian Church in Essex, London. Lindsay believed that Unitarian Christianity would not restrict its members' beliefs. Lindsay also helped to spread Unitarianism to Wales through his correspondence with Thomas Glyn Cothey, a Welsh poet, Unitarian, and a political activist. Later, the Unitarian offices of the First British and Unitarian Foreign Unitarian Association and the General Assembly of Unitarian and Free Christian Churches were established at the Essex Street Chapel. On the 17th of April in 1774, Theophilus Lindsay held the first Unitarian service in Britain at the newly formed Essex Street Chapel in London. At this service, he designed his own liturgy, from which many were critical. Lindsay remained there as minister until 1793, when he resigned and left his charge to John Disney, who, like him, left the Church of England for Unitarianism. Isaac Newton was born prematurely in December of 1642 in the county of Lincolnshire, England, and lived until 1727. From the age of about 12 until he was 17, Newton was educated at the King's School in Grantham, England, in which he was taught Latin, Greek, and probably learned a significant amount of mathematics there too. In 1859, his mother moved him from the school to return home, where she attempted to persuade him to be a farmer, which he hated. The King's School persuaded his mother to let him return to King's School, where he became one of the top-ranked students. In June of 1661, Isaac was admitted to Trinity College in Cambridge upon recommendation. Isaac Newton became an English mathematician, astronomer, theologian, author, and physicist, who was important in the Unitarian story because of his unorthodox beliefs and his interest in reason and science. Newton was also considered a heretic because of his unorthodox Christian views. He demonstrated an extensive knowledge of early church writings, in which he took the view of Arius, who rejected the conventional view of the Trinity. In 1667, Newton went on to Cambridge University, and a few months later was elected as a Fellow of Trinity. Fellows were required to become ordained priests, although conformity to the Church of England was not enforced during the years of the Restoration period, and becoming a Fellow of Trinity was sufficient enough. By 1675, the issue couldn't be avoided, because Newton's unconventional views stood in the way, so he was not allowed to continue. With his study in religion, Newton had much knowledge of early church writings of the Arian theology. Isaac Newton is known for his numerous developments in science and mathematics. With the three universal laws of motion, which laid the foundation for classical mechanics, a heliocentric view of our solar system, that the Earth orbits the Sun and not the other way around, the development of the first practical telescope, and the theory of light and color, how white light decomposes into colors of the visible spectrum, which are known as the rainbow colors. And as a mathematician, Newton was one of the people who independently developed a form of math called calculus, which is the mathematics of the rates of change. He also developed the study of a generalized theorem of non-integer exponents and classified most of the cubic plane of curves. Please join me in singing our second hymn, number 331, Life is the Greatest Gift of All. The next section is about Unitarianism in early America from the 18th to 19th century. Unitarianism emphasized reason and appealed to the conscience as a path to perfection, instead of emotions like in revivals. Unitarianism in America also leaned towards focusing on importance of social reforms. Unitarianism in America attracted the elite and the wealthy. During the 18th to the 20th century, there were numerous people who influenced the Unitarian religion. Some of those people we will hear about today are Abigail Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Freeman, William Ellery Channing, Aidan Ballou, and Theodore Parker. In the 18th century America, Unitarianism was awakening under the influence of English figures like Lindsay and Priestley. This reawakening grew from a negative reaction to the Great Awakening, which lasted from 1734 to 1743. The Great Awakening was a highly Calvinistic and fundamentalist revival. Many ministers of non-Trinitarian traditions in New England were appalled at the attacks on free will that the ministers of the Great Awakening were making. The Great Awakening was a fundamental movement in evangelism, where new birth was considered the ultimate religious experience. Followers of the Great Awakening accepted that they were sinners and asked for salvation by accepting Jesus as their Savior. During this time, many other denominations were founded, such as the Methodists, Baptists, and Lutherans. The Quakers, Unitarians, and Universalists grew stronger through the rejection of this evangelistic period. These beliefs helped the development of Unitarianism in America in the 18th and 19th century. Some prominent deists were Abigail Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Abigail Adams was born in 1744 and was the wife and closest friend of John Adams, the first vice president and second president of the United States and a Unitarian. Abigail Adams is mostly remembered for her letters written to her husband during the Continental Congresses. John frequently sought the advice of Abigail on many matters, such as intellectual discussions on government and politics, women's rights, and anti-slavery. Her letters serve as eyewitness accounts of the American Revolutionary War home front. Abigail also wrote about the concerns of women and was an advocate of women's rights, especially in education. She believed that women should not have to submit to laws not made in women's interests, nor should they be content with being unequal to their husbands, but as companions. Her views on theology evolved over the course of her life. A letter to her son in 1816 gives us a view into her religious beliefs. I acknowledge myself a Unitarian, believing that the Father alone is the supreme God, and that Jesus Christ derived his being and all his powers and honors from the Father. There is not any reasoning which convince me, contrary to my senses, that 3 is 1 and 1 3. She also wrote a letter in January 1818, a few months before her death, to her daughter-in-law, asking, "When will mankind be convinced that true religion is from the heart, between man and his Creator, and not the imposition of man or creeds and tests?" Abigail was an active member of the First Parish Church in Quincy, Massachusetts, which became Unitarian in doctrine by 1753. She and her husband, John Adams, are both buried there. Abigail Adams passed away in October of 1818. Thomas Jefferson was born in 1743 on a plantation in Virginia and passed away on July 4th in 1826. He was one of the founding fathers of the United States and the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. He was the second vice president under John Adams and the third president of the United States from 1807 to 1809. Jefferson served as Secretary of State, a diplomatic minister, and a congressman. He served as governor of Virginia and a member of the House, as well as other various offices. He also worked as a lawyer, an architect, a writer, a farmer, and as a patriarch of an extended both white and black family at Monticello. All in all, he spent almost 5 decades in public service. When he was 14, his father passed away, and he was left with a sizable estate of 5,000 acres. He dreamed of living on a mountain and cleared off some of the land and named it Monticello. He would spend the next 40 years building and rebuilding a house that would be home to his and extended family. He had 6 children with his wife, Martha Wales Skelton, but only 2 children lived to adulthood. Martha passed away after 10 years of marriage. Along with the land, Jefferson inherited slaves from his father and father-in-law. Many of these slaves lived and worked at Monticello, in which they were important in running his farms, buildings, and maintaining Monticello. A small group of slaves were given special positions as they were part of his extended family. The writing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776 was a defining point in Thomas Jefferson's life. He wrote a stunning statement of the colonists' right to rebel against the British government and the establish their own based on the premise that all men are created equal and have the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the United States Declaration of Independence was adopted by the Second Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, on July 4, 1776. It explained that the 13 colonies were no longer under British rule and now regarded themselves as independent sovereign states. With this declaration, the new states took the first step towards forming the United States of America. The Declaration provides clear and empathetic statements supporting self-government and individual rights, and it has become a model of such statements for several hundred years and around the world, here and around the world. Thomas Jefferson was a proponent of the First Amendment, that there should be a wall of separation between church and state to have a strong democracy. In 1777, Thomas Jefferson drafted the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, in which he declared that men shall be free to possess their opinions in matter of religion. Jefferson supported a broad religious freedom and opposed any linkage between church and state, insisting that, quote, "It does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg," end quote. In 1802, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut. Quote, "I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that the legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." As a youth, Jefferson was baptized in the Episcopal Church. Then during his college years, he was influenced by deist authors and abandoned his Orthodox Christianity after rereading the New Testament. He was committed to the belief of the existence of a benevolent and just God. Thomas Jefferson rejected the notion of the Trinity and Jesus' divinity. He also rejected biblical miracles, the resurrection, the atonement, and original sin. Jefferson admired Jesus and the purity, eloquence, and beauty of his moral teachings. At times, he described Jesus' moral and ethical teachings as, quote, "primitive Christianity," before their perversion by the church leaders seeking power. Jefferson compiled a Bible of Jesus' teachings, in which he went through the Gospels of the Bible and literally focused on the parts he thought would be legitimate teachings of Jesus, omitting all the miraculous supernatural references as well as the resurrection. This work was entitled The Life and Morals of the Jesus of Nazareth, and commonly referred to as the Jefferson Bible. Unlike the New England liberal Congregationalist ministers who approached Unitarianism through Arianism, James Freeman was a Socinian in theology and developed a link with Unitarians in England. James Freeman was born in April 1759 in Massachusetts. In 1782, the Episcopals at King's Chapel in Boston, Massachusetts, asked Freeman to officiate as their reader for 6 months. Freeman was well liked at King's Chapel, so when his 6 months were concluded at Easter in 1783, the proprietors asked him to become the pastor of the church. After reading Joseph Priestley's A History of the Corruptions of Christianity and Theophilus Lindsay's A Historical View of the State of the Unitarian Doctrine and Worship from the Reformation to Our Own Times, Freeman began to further doubt the doctrine of the Trinity and became increasingly uncomfortable with the liturgy in the Book of Common Prayer. As he adopted the Socinian Unitarian views of Priestley and Lindsay, he rejected the pre-human existence of Jesus. He told his closer friends at the church that he could not conscientiously perform the services as it stood, and wondered if he should relinquish his position as pastor. One of his friends suggested that he present his dilemma to the congregation and let them decide. So, in 1784, Freeman began to preach a series of sermons on the unity of God, stating his dissatisfaction with certain parts of the liturgy, and giving his reason for rejection of the Trinity. He was concerned because these sermons were controversial and was afraid that these would be his last sermons ever given. To his surprise, he was heard patiently, attentively, and kindly. He was able to persuade the church to alter the liturgy, eliminating all references to the Trinity and addressing all prayers to God the Father. King's Chapel in Boston, Massachusetts, was the first church in America to make such changes to the liturgy, and thus might be considered the first Anglican and Unitarian church in the country. It remains a cornerstone of Unitarian Christianity even today. James Freeman ended up serving as the minister of King's Chapel for 43 years, from 1783 to 1826. He was the first clergyman in America to call himself a Unitarian. James Freeman met every 2 weeks with a group of 20 liberal ministers in the Boston area, where they discussed religion, morals, and civic order relating to their congregations. It was during these meetings that he was appointed to a committee charged with considering the creation of a formal body of Unitarians. Through this committee, in 1825, the founding of the American Unitarian Association began. Freeman was also one of the founders of the Massachusetts Historical Society, in which he served as a recording secretary from 1798 to 1812. He was also a member of the American Humane Society, the American Academy of Arts and Scientists, and the Massachusetts Peace Society. James served on the Boston School Committee for many years, beginning in 1792, and was a delegate at the Massachusetts Constitutional Convention in 1820 to 21. William Ellery Channing was born in Newport, Rhode Island in 1780 and died in 1842 in Bennington, Vermont. He was an author and moralist, a Congregationalist, and later became a Unitarian clergyman, and worked towards eliminating slavery, drunkenness, poverty, and war. Channing became a successful preacher, known for his articulate and passionate sermons and public speeches, preaching morality, charity, and Unitarian Christian responsibilities. His religion and thoughts were among the chief influences of the New England Transcendentalists, although he never admitted or accepted them, as he saw their views were extreme. Believing that a Unitarian orthodoxy would be just as oppressive as any other, in 1820 he formed a conference of liberal congregational ministers, along with James Freeman, which later in 1825 was organized as the American Unitarian Association. Channing's interest in politics grew, and he believed that political reform, like religious reform, needed to start from within. He focused his political efforts at humanitarian causes, the abolition of slavery, the crusade against drinking, and the importance and the improvement of conditions for the poor. Channing believed that a harmonious and happy nation could be achieved through appealing to man's innate goodness. Channing's most famous sermon, 1819 sermon, which was our reading today, was a public declaration for the Unitarian cause and formulated the creed for the Unitarianism. It stated that one cannot be free without recognizing that all human beings are the image of God, and that love has no bounds. Quote, I call that mind free which sets no bounds to its love, which recognizes in all human beings the image of God and the rights of his children. Other influential sermons were given, but the sermon Unitarian Christianity, Most Favorable to Piety, in 1826, emphasized the relevance of the movement and its personal foundation. We regard Unitarianism as particularly the friend of an inward, living, practical religion. Because of these speeches, William Ellery Channing was called the father of American Unitarianism. Please join me in singing our next hymn, number 300, With a Heart and Mind, from our hymnal Singing the Living Tradition. Biddle was born in 1803 and was a prominent American proponent of pacifism, socialism, and abolitionism. From an early age, he was a strongly religious man who at the age of 10 converted his whole family to the Restorationist religion, a charismatic Christian movement seeking to restore the belief and practices of the early church. He eventually decided to be a Universalist minister, like his distant cousin, Jose Biddle, but then he came to oppose the views of Universalism and converted to Unitarianism. He tirelessly fought for social reform through his radical and Christian socialist views, especially through the temperance movement, abolition, and government resistance. Biddle continued to practice Christian non-resistance and refused to take up violence to support his belief. Biddle founded the Hopedale community, a utopian community blending the features of a factory town with those of a religion-based commune. In 1842, Biddle and his followers purchased 600 acres of land in Milford, Massachusetts, in which they built homes, chapels, and factories for their company that they had formed. His hope for the Hopedale community was that it would be not isolated from the rest of society and that it would become a beacon of social reform in the time of the Civil War. The community stood for temperance, abolitionism, women's rights, spiritualism, and education. Though after only 14 years, Hopedale community went bankrupt, and then the intentional community was converted back into a textile factory town. Theodore Parker lived from 1810 to 1860. He was an American Unitarian preacher, lecturer, writer, public intellectual, abolitionist, and a religious social reformer who played a major role in moving Unitarianism away from being a Bible-based faith and towards transcendentalism. Theodore Parker rejected the traditional Christian dogma for an intuitive knowledge of God, derived from man's experience of nature and insight into his own mind. Parker resembled Ralph Waldo Emerson and the New England Transcendentalists in intuition, but had different views and scientific interests. He was known for his activism that inspired future generations of liberal leaders. Parker's activism called for him to be involved in working for prison reform, temperance, and women's issues. He gave impassioned speeches against slavery, helped fugitive slaves escape, and wrote about the abolitionist movement. Theodore Parker was an extremely controversial figure in his own day, and his legacy to the Unitarian Universalism remains firm. His words and popular quotations would later inspire speeches by Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. Never violate the sacredness of your individual self-respect. And the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I encourage everyone to be on the lookout for emails from the church office. They are the best way to keep up to date on announcements and updates at First Unitarian Church. You may also check our website, newsletter, and Facebook page. Please contact the church office if you have an event or announcement that you would like to share with us via our weekly Church This Week email. And now, if you have a lit chalice or candle near you, I invite you to join me in extinguishing the chalice. The light of truth and meaning cannot be put out. We are keepers of this flame until we meet again. We just heard about the Unitarian forefathers in England and America who helped establish Unitarianism from the 17th to the 19th centuries. In England, we heard about the importance of establishing religious freedom, bringing science and religion together, and the founding of the First Unitarian Church in England. In the early American colonies, we learned about how Unitarianism helped define our democracy, the importance of establishing religious freedom, to rewriting liturgical texts to be non-Trinitarian, and to establishing the first Unitarian organization, the American Unitarian Association. And this is only the middle of the 19th century. We have plenty more people to talk about next month when we finish with the Unitarians in America up to the 20th century. For our postlude, we have a video of hymn 1058, Be Ours a Religion, words from Theodore Parker, and music written by Unitarian Universalist musician Thomas Benjamin. Please enjoy this video made and performed by Jan Jaffe.